right. So, thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm pretty excited. You guys' museum, although I've never been there, I'm a big fan. I follow along on your social media, and I really respect what Emily's done there and the whole group. And so I was sort of honored to be asked, and I hope you can invite me back up for an in-person at some point. I'd love to make it through. It's kind of a special part of the world to me, that northern Wisconsin area that you guys are in. And thank you all for joining me tonight on the Zoom meeting. I know you said it was sort of a nice night out, and I agree. If I get distracted, it's because I've got 3 hummingbirds in my backyard kind of darting in and out. But I feel like people were really on board with the Zoom concept, maybe in April, and now that we're into August, we're maybe a little over it. So, I especially appreciate you taking time out of your evening to join me. If I do get interrupted, it's because the dogs are, it's treat time in dog world, but we'll power through that. I, not too long ago, lived in Wisconsin myself. I was down in the Milwaukee area. I was a naturalist for the Ware Nature Center, and there's Willow the Wonder Mutts on the shores of Lake Michigan. So Wisconsin's always been important to me. I got the Wisconsin Association for Environmental Education. It's one of the awards that I'm most proud of, and I try to stick into my biographies always, because there's such a heritage of strong naturalists and educators in Wisconsin. And so I got a lot of my training in Wisconsin, and it will always be, an important place to me. And the thing about a non-formal educator, you can tell I'm the least formal educator as I'm chewing down the tree there, but my background actually didn't start in education. So I grew up in Wyoming. I'm a Wyoming kid. I joke that I was a feral child, and I mean that in the best sense of the term. It's just one of those where I think many folks can relate to this, where we spent a lot of time outside, and we would come home when it got dark, and our parents gave us pretty free reign of our neighborhoods to explore, whether it was on a bicycle or, in my case, or, out pounding the pavement or flipping over rocks or digging in the dirt or playing in the creek. And unfortunately, that's not the case for everyone anymore. And kids aren't necessarily spending as much time outside. And even the parents of kids didn't grow up that way. And so I think as environmental educators, we have a big ask in front of us. But I think, we're kind of all up for the challenge. I went to college at the University of Wyoming, and I had visions of being a biologist. I went to the Teton Science School as a high school student, and realized you could be a biologist, a field biologist. Science wasn't just white lab coats and medical doctors. You could go out and get paid to pick up wildlife scat. And so I got to travel all over. I was a field biologist in a number of locations. I did research on flying squirrels in Alaska. I worked on a prairie dog study in northeast Wyoming. I worked on some migration things in western Wyoming. And at one point, I got to go off to the Gobi Desert to chase camels, which I went to Campbell County High School, home of the camels, one of 2 high schools in the country that have a camel as a mascot. So it was kind of ironic that I got to study camels for a bit. And so, but what I found with all of these field biology projects was that the research was cool and exciting, but I also really enjoyed, the education side of it. And so talking to loggers in Alaska about flying squirrel biology, and talking to, recreational prairie dog shooters in Thunder Basin National Grassland about the endangered black-footed ferrets and the black-tailed prairie dogs and that whole entire ecosystem. And so I shifted into the education realm of things. And there's another picture from Wisconsin there that's at the Ware Nature Center wearing my Milwaukee Bucks hat. And that communications, I was able to kind of expand out into freelance communications. And so I do magazine work and some online publications, and I'm also a book writer, and I've written a number of kids' books, but my recent title, Earth Almanac, we're going to focus on tonight, is much more of an adult nonfiction title. And so with Earth Almanac, I really structured it to go as a march through the seasons, and it's, sort of a greatest hits of nature, although I feel like that might be a bit of an oversell. It might be the greatest hits of the underappreciated parts of nature. And with 365 entries, I got to cover a lot of territory, and there's hopefully some things in here that make you kind of ponder, like, oh, I didn't really know that, sort of, those overlooked parts of nature. The concept for Earth Almanac for me goes back to when I spent my summers in Grand Teton National Park, and I was working on a small mammal research project, and we were trapping microtus, trapping little vole species, kind of small mouse-looking rodent things. And I joked at the time that I was a wolf ecologist, and I stand by that statement, in that we were looking at the impacts of the reintroduction of wolves into the ecosystem, and we were looking at it from the lens of these small mammals, though. And so that whole project just reinforces to me how much everything in nature is connected. And so that at that point, the wolf story, a lot of folks know that the wolves were sort of extirpated from Yellowstone, were brought back in and released in 1995, and have slowly expanded in numbers and in range. And so we were looking at sort of pre-wolf, post-wolf numbers in Grand Teton National Park. And what's fascinating is that research is starting to show that, the reintroduction of an apex predator like that has just this trophic cascade effect on the entire ecosystem. And so with the reintroduction of wolves, now we're starting to see that elk on the landscape are moving a lot more, that willow trees are starting to grow back and respond, and the cottonwoods and the riparian bottoms, because elk can't just camp out of those bottoms. And so the songbirds are responding, the small mammals are responding. So because we've released wolves in Yellowstone, we have more yellow warblers. And so sort of all of this concept about nature being so interconnected. And also, when I was up there, I read every year I read For Everything There's a Season by Frank Craighead. And that sort of, I always knew seasonality was a thing, but that really tied phenology, and that each of these things happen on a, sort of a time scale. And so that's where the concept from Earth Almanac came from. Shout out definitely to Jeremy Collins. He's the illustrator. And honestly, even though I wrote the book, the illustrations are my favorite part. So Jeremy's a great illustrator, and just a wonderful kind of environmental champion on his own. So that's actually the same, you can see Mount Moran, it's a little Skillet Glacier in the same picture back there. But so when I went off to college, I thought I was going to be a biologist, and this meme's been making the rounds. But when you think you're going to be a biologist, you're like, I'm going to go out in the field all the time and explore. I'm going to live with the penguins. Really, as a biologist, I spend my time answering text messages from friends that say, "What is this? What hawk is this?" when they mean it's a turkey vulture. So I think many of us as environmental education can relate to that. And so if you're not the go-to person for "what bird is this" texts, I don't know if you can call yourself a naturalist. For Earth Almanac, I started the book with the winter solstice. And as a naturalist, January 1st, it's an important day on the calendar, but symbolically, it's not any different than December 31st or January 2nd. It's just another winter day. And so when you really become in tune with the seasons, the solstice and the equinox, those are the important dates to start and end your journeys on. And so winter solstice, the solstice is sort of Latin for sun stops, sun stands still. It's the shortest day, and it doesn't mean much, it's more of a moral victory in Barrow, Alaska, where it's still going to be dark tomorrow, just like it was yesterday. But the winter solstice means that, those days are slowly starting to get longer. What's interesting is the solstice is not necessarily the coldest days of the year, and that's due to sort of global inertia, the kind of temporal inertia, the core Earth temperature. We've settled in, and we've got a little bit of residual heat from the summer and the fall. And so the colder days are a few, weeks or even a month later in kind of January and February. But it was important to start Earth Almanac to me on the winter solstice day. So for this book, we've marched through, as every day of the year gets an entry, and it's mammal stuff, it's bird stuff, it's astronomy, it's geology, it's, sort of all the things in nature. And I thought today I'd kind of march through some of my favorites. So I think it's important to, the lens that we look through the world in is really indicative of our world in a lot of cases. And I spent a lot of my life living on the Interstate 80 latitude, sort of whether it was Wyoming or when I was in Wisconsin. I lived in Maryland for a while. I'm in Iowa now, but it's always been about the I-80 corridor. South of us, winter is the time to shine for wildlife. I'm lucky to have my mom lives in Arizona, my in-laws live in Florida. Winter is a great time to be in the desert Southwest. It's a great time to be in southern Florida and the Everglades and exploring. It's a great time for these wildlife critters to shine. And so I think sometimes from my own sort of now Midwestern perspective, winter is those cold, snowy days. But I always find sort of solstice knowing that for the Gila monster, winter solstice in January is the best days of the year. A Gila monster only has to eat about twice a year. This, 2-foot long lizard that lives down, it's the state reptile of Utah. You can see it's got that sort of chubby tail. That's basically the camel hump for the Gila monster. It stores that energy and kind of that fat storage in that tail, and so it can survive on not much. But on these winter days, it comes out from its underground burrows and takes in a big meal. The desert tortoise, I joke that I hate this slide because I've never seen a desert tortoise, I've never seen a gopher tortoise, and I've never seen a Gila monster. So these to me still represent things that I need to get out there and explore more. I've spent a lot of time looking for them, but desert tortoises and gopher tortoises all sort of, kind of live in the southern United States, the desert tortoise in the southwest and the gopher tortoise in the southeast. But again, for these critters, winter is a cooler period. It's where they do their breeding. It's where they do a lot of their eating. But in our part of the world, and in your part of the world, in northern Wisconsin there, winter is a season of a blanket of snow. So can you see my little weasel down here? This is the subnivean zone, kind of that area underneath the snow. And it might be 10 degrees below zero air temperature, but under that nice insulating blanket of snow, it stays about 32 degrees all year, and there's a whole ecosystem that happens. So I have a pop quiz. I don't know if you were expecting, to be tested tonight, but we'll see if we can get that quiz up. So up north, the weasels turn white in the winter, but the question is, for the southern weasels, do they change colors in the south for the winter? Do they change every year? Do they only change during the coldest seasons, or do they not change colors for the season? So people, if they want to play along and take a vote here. I don't know if I have to vote to make it work too. So the weasels, there's a number of species. We got the long-tailed weasel, the short-tailed weasel, and there's the least weasel as well. I think this is probably a short-tailed weasel in the picture on the bottom right there. That I took that in Milwaukee, in Franklin, at the Ware Nature Center in southeast Wisconsin. It's clearly a summer picture there with the green, but I don't know. Can we have some results to our poll?
Sure. We'll end the poll and
see if anybody played along. Wow, you're pretty smart folks there. Nope, never. So yeah. The weasels in the south do stay brown all year long, and the research that's out there is pretty fascinating. People have actually relocated weasels from the south and brought them north. They've taken northern weasels and brought them to the south. And for that species, for those species, that whole set of weasels, they don't change even if you bring them to different ecosystems. So it's pretty fascinating to me, and kind of the whole species concept is pretty fascinating to me. But the elasticity in phenotypes on nature is pretty cool. So weasels are one of the ones I think of when I think of that subnivean zone. But I also think of like the grouse, like ruffed grouse. Sometimes they'll settle in and let that snow sort of blanket on top of them, and that thermal regulation is an important part. What's really cool, I spent a lot of time in Grand Teton National Park and stuff, and a lot of skiers also rely on this sort of same information, that bottom layer of snow, as it compacts, the actual chemical or the kind of physical structure of the snow changes, and you get that sugar snow, which is not very stable. That's what causes avalanches. That's bad if you're a skier, but that same sugar snow, as it sort of, forms and loses the moisture content, that's what makes it possible for these critters to live underneath that snow blanket. So move on to a couple more winter examples here. So this is a pika. This is a summer picture as well. Pikas live on the high mountain slopes out west, kind of that talus, those big gravel fields sort of above the tree line in the western mountains. This is a species that also relies heavily on that snowpack. And so you would think a critter that makes its life up in the mountaintops in the west, hibernation is the thing that I would assume this critter does, but that's not the case. What pika do instead, they spend that, it's a short summer at 10,000 feet elevation, but they spend their summers collecting vegetation, and they actually kind of dry it out and they cure it. let it dry out, and then they sort of stuff it in under these rock crevices and make little haystacks. And they're active all winter long, and they live on this, stored hay. They can harvest about a bushel of hay each year to survive on and get them through the winter. And so, on the one hand, you might think that warming global temperatures would help a critter at that high elevation. You'd be like, wow, the winter's a little bit shorter now. That's got to be a good thing if you're trying to eke out a living and you're trying to survive the winter active and alert. But it's actually the opposite for the pika. So that critter relies on that blanket of snow, that thermal threshold, to help maintain its survival. And so as the snowpack's getting less, those pika are actually struggling to survive at that high elevation. It's kind of one of those early indicators. And there's some shifting on the landscape, but if you're at the top of the mountain, you can't retreat higher up on the mountain. So it's one of the early indicators of some of the climate concerns that we have for species. There's another couple of ways to adapt to a winter survival rate. And so this is a big bull moose. And late season moose, kind of the goal in life is always calories in have to be more than calories out, or else you're going to burn those, body reserves and you're going to starve to death. And so these late season, this guy's got big old paddles. He's going to lose those antlers here in a little bit and get kind of late winter. But sometimes the moose will rather than exerting all that energy to plow through the snow and, fight the snowpack, they'll just hang tight. They'll just camp out. They'll sit for, maybe a week at a time. It's called feeding cessation, where they're just not going to eat because it's more exertion and more effort and energy to go try and forage than it is to sit there. And so a lot of times you'll find, you find moose carcasses or some of these wildlife, these winter mortality. It's one of the hardest seasons to get through, as a wildlife out there. And sometimes they don't make it through the winter, and you'll find a carcass in the springtime when they didn't survive. But winter, there's many ways to face winter. You can either embrace it, you can either avoid it by migrating or by hibernating. And so this is a black bear, and you can see sort of the palms there, sable palms in the background there. This is an April photo. And so we talked about the weasels, that if you take these southern weasels, they stay brown all year. What about southern black bears? Do they hibernate in the winter? It turns out they don't, but this is an important distinction. They've retained the ability to hibernate. And so physiologically, black bears could still, if they were under those pressures of, kind of those winter pressures, they could go into hibernation. They've retained that ability as a species. And so it's always sort of fascinating just how the dynamics of nature. Quick side story, my college professor studied black bear hibernation physiology. And so when I was in college at the University of Wyoming one winter, he would go out, and Dr. Harlow, he would put radio collars on bears so we could do telemetry and figure out where they were denning up for the winter, where they were sort of hibernating in. I went with him on a day project where we hiked in, snowshoed back into this place, and there was a big kind of a rock, and it had sort of fallen off. And so we knew the bear was in this little channel, this sort of, chute of rocks. And Hank told me, he was like, we're going to go in, we're going to dart the bear and give them a little bit of a sedative and take some blood samples and some other work on it. And then, we'll move out and let the bear be. But I always remember Hank told me, he's like, she might, be alert, because hibernation for black bears especially, they're not just like conked out for the whole year. They're the whole winter. They can sort of be up and alert, and when they hear us coming in, they might bolt. And so Hank's like, don't let, there's a female bear, it's like, don't let her come out the side channel there. And I was like, Hank, if a bear comes out, like, what am I supposed to do? He's like, we just like pop her on the nose a little bit. Just think you got a little shovel there, just give her a little nose bop. And so, black bears, I do not recommend, waking a sleeping grizzly bear, but if you say let sleeping dogs lie, you should probably definitely let sleeping bears lie as well. But what Hank was showing, it was really cool physiologically, is that if you think of a human with a broken arm, the atrophy on that muscle is just gonna, you don't use that muscle, it shrinks up because you're not using it just in days and weeks. And for these bears, they can be in hibernation for weeks or months at a time. And they lose some of that muscle mass, but they don't lose near as much as you might think compared to ours. And so what's going on is probably there's some nutrient recycling, but also it seems like they're sort of flexing their muscles all winter long and sort of staying not active, but sort of staying fit. And part of how he did that was he had us students, including me, wear bear collars and hop on a stationary bike. And so we would exercise for an hour, we would hop off, and he would do temperature logs and stuff. And so, yeah, hibernation, I can give a whole talk on hibernation, but let's move on to the spring. So tackling a phenology book with a nationwide scale was exciting. It's difficult because what's happening in, Louisiana is not the same thing that's happening in northern Wisconsin. And so if you're a spring peeper, the southern peeper is starting to be active and alert as early as like November or December. But in your part of the world, where we're from, it could be April or May before we're starting to hear those peepers peep. And so I had a lot of flexibility on some of these species accounts. And so I stuck the peeper, and I think I put it in February, kind of that mid-range of spring is happening across North America. It might not be happening in your day, that instance, but peepers and wood frogs, there's a couple of others that these things literally freeze solid in the winter. They've got cool physiology going on, and that intercellular space can freeze, and they can just be basically a little frog sickle all winter long. And then as the days warm up, they thaw out and get active again. And so that just blows my mind. Some things I had to put on very specific dates, though. So this is an example of that. This is the Starling. This is my March 6th entry on Earth Almanac. And so the Starling is kind of a European species. And in 1890, Eugene Schifflin was a pharmaceutical manufacturer in New York and part of the American Acclimatization Society. And they had the notion to relocate species from all over the world. And Eugene, he had a special idea to bring all of the birds mentioned in Shakespeare plays and release them in North America. And so remember, this was 100 and some years ago. We've since realized that rearranging and moving species across the globe has very dire consequences in many cases, and the Starling is an example of that. But with 200 million Starling in our country now, it blows my mind to think that they started with a flock of 40 birds released in Central Park on March 6th, 1890. That's, what tinkering with nature can have impacts that go far beyond what we imagine. When I think of nature, I really am a firm believer that nature's everywhere. It's where we look for it, it's where we find it, it's in our backyards. I say it's from backyard to mountaintop. It's from, everywhere. But there are also big time iconic nature experiences, and sort of my nature bucket list definitely includes the spring sandhill crane migration in central Nebraska. And I know Wisconsin's got a number of cranes all breeding, across summers, and you get good migration and stuff. But if you've never made the trip to central Nebraska along the Platte River between Kearney and Grand Island, that is such an experience. And, you hear cranes where you're from, and they're, rattling off their call. You hear a pair of them calling back and forth and trumpeting, but 500,000 cranes going off at once is definitely a bucket list trip for everyone. So kind of brings us to mid-March in our year. Spring for me is also a season for foraging, and I've worked in Southeast Alaska for a while on a flying squirrel project, and up there, spring meant fiddlehead fern season. And fiddleheads, it's not a species of fern, it's sort of any of the ferns. They always sort of curl up with that fiddlehead, and it unravels as they grow throughout the growing season. And not all species are edible, but the ones that are, you can kind of saute them up in garlic butter and make a delicious little treat. And morel mushrooms, that's another one that really is an iconic species for folks to connect with nature with. I put morels as the March 24th entry. It happens to be my birthday. I've not actually got much morel experience, and so I did that on purpose to challenge myself to always keep learning and always keep exploring. As spring rolls around, we get into another kind of iconic phenology concept, and there's a number of ways to be involved with nature. And for me, these sort of citizen science, these community science opportunities are really what one of the main takeaways I hope people get from Earth Almanac is that anyone can be involved in research and involved in science. And so the cherry blossoms, there's a number of cherry blossom festivals all over the country, and the Washington D.C. one sort of the most iconic. And that those cherry trees were actually a gift from the mayor of Tokyo to the Washington D.C. mayor. And now you kind of have that whole cherry blossom down on the square that's administered by the National Park Service. And so researchers have shown with the phenological shift on the cherry blossoms. And so it's about a week earlier now than it had been, even as recently as the 70s. And so they have a big cherry blossom festival each year trying to match with peak bloom. And honestly, the book's probably a little bit late too. I should have preemptively shifted the date on the calendar a little bit, but sort of the phenology of it, they measure, they kind of quantify these green buds. Then when the florets are visible, kind of the extension of florets is another stage. And this is my favorite new science concept when I was researching the book. Peduncle elongation. And so as these flowerets are starting to expand, kind of the peduncle elongation stage of the cherry blossoms leads to the puffy white blossoms and then full bloom after that. And so I've found in this year, especially, you know, we're all sort of been hunkered down and quarantined and a lot more time in our own neighborhoods and backyards, that for me, watching the seasons through a botanical perspective has been my new challenge to myself, and it's been really neat to kind of watch. And I've always been a bird guy, but for me, the kind of the botany scene is what I've taken away this spring as something to look forward to in future years. And a lot of this work with the cherry blossoms and many of these other things I talk about as far as shifting timelines on phenology, I'll send back to work that the National Phenology Network is doing, including this. So the National Phenology Network has looked at some of the research in that the walleye have also shifted their breeding up, kind of matching with spring ice out. And so this data from Minnesota, Lake Minnetonka in Minnesota, kind of just south, I think, west of the Twin Cities there, the median date of ice out is April 14th. And that's got pretty big range on it, including fairly recently, one of their latest dates on record was early May, but, you know, kind of on average, that April 14th is what they're shifting for. But as that shifts earlier, they're showing that the walleye spawning is actually responding to that earlier. There's a number of these phenological mismatches, though, that are happening where things are changing in nature, but not at the same rate. And so back to our spring peepers, they're calling a little bit earlier, but toads are staying pretty stagnant as far as their timing of nature goes, or timing of calling goes. And so there's no blanket statements we can make about any of these changes in phenology. That's what I learned when researching the book. Spring to me, I grew up in Wyoming, and for me, the sage grouse there, kind of that top left corner, that was a sign of the spring. I made an attempt every year to go out and watch sage grouse leks. And so these breeding congregations of sage grouse, also sharp-tailed grouse. The top right picture there, the prairie chicken that was taken outside Stevens Point. I gave a presentation to the college there a few years ago, and got to go out and watch prairie chickens as well. And as I was becoming a naturalist and a conservationist, I had an early mentor that he gave me 2 books to read, and he made me read Alda Leopold's San County Almanac. He's like, start here. And then the follow-up book was Edward Abbey's Monkey Wrench Gang. And so sort of both approaches to environmental and nature. But I'll always remember reading that kind of the sky dance essays from Leopold. And as a Wyoming kid watching the sage grouse, I was a bit snobby about it. I'm not going to lie. I thought, how could anything that just sort of flutters up in the sky be nearly as cool as this sage grouse, this big booming, you know, movement of sage, you know, can you see those air sacs on that sage grouse in that picture, you know. When I moved east and got to watch the American woodcock in action, I realized that both are very iconic spring experiences. And so I'm team woodcock now for sure, but that always brings in the seasons for me. writing Earth Almanac, I was up against a pretty tight deadline. I was, trying to release the book in relation to the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, and that did happen. You're right. We got it out in March, just in time for Earth Day 2020 to arrive. But I think Earth Day, in its moment, Senator Gaylord Nelson, the Wisconsin senator there, is sort of responsible and kind of one of the early pioneers of Earth Day. And what makes Earth Day such a fascinating and such a successful event is that it really, despite being, sort of global, it depends on these grassroots and these local efforts. And so I think it's always important and reminding ourselves that these things, kind of environmental change happens at a local scale, and it can be sort of intimidating and daunting to look at the big picture and the world impacts. But what we do in our own neighborhood really has an impact. And so that's sort of one of my takeaways with Earth Day is that, Earth Day is every day and Earth Day is everywhere, especially in our own neighborhoods. As spring rolls around, migration is one of the things that I think of with spring. I spent a number of years working in Northwest Ohio and worked for the Black Swamp Bird Observatory and the biggest week in American birding. And it's one of the most iconic places for spring migration. And it's great for the birds. They all sort of congregate as they get up to the shores of Lake Erie before they'll, cross onto it. So it's really good. It's really good birding. But what they've also done there is really built out the community aspect of it and really sort of championed people in the realm of environmental efforts. And so we all have migration in our own backyard. I wanted to add a slide today just about this spring. I spent more time staring out my windows than I had in years past, and just it's like a Christmas every day. You guys are all, I'm sure everyone loves spring migration, kind of all migration junkies, and watching, what's going to happen next. And this year I had a summer tanager showed up in the backyard and hung around for a couple of days, and had a yellow-throated warbler hanging out at the suet feeder for just a bit. And second year in a row I've seen it. And so migration always kind of gets me excited and reinvigorated for the seasons. But I also lived on the East Coast for a while, and this is another sort of iconic migration. And the red knots moving along the East Coast there, they've sort of timed their phenology and timed their seasonality with the horseshoe crabs. And so horseshoe crabs, not, actually related to like hermit crabs or the other crabs at all. They're more like related to scorpions and things, but sort of a prehistoric species. And the horseshoe crabs come and breed, especially sort of that Delaware Bay area and along the Atlantic coast. And they're so cool. They lay just millions of green eggs in the sand. Apologies to Dr. Seuss. And the red knots come through, and other shorebirds, but especially kind of the red knots there. And the timing of that is so essential and essential to the knot migration. And so one of those iconic experiences, I would add that to my bucket list nature experience, would be the red knots and the horseshoe crabs in the Delaware Bay. Another thing when you get into nature is the naming of things. And names can be a little confusing. And so my example here with the rhododendrons, this is the Catawba species in Roan Mountain, kind of the North Carolina, Tennessee border. But rhododendron is the state flower in Washington, and the great laurel, which is actually in the same genus, is the state flower of West Virginia. And so sometimes one of the things about nature is it can be a little confusing to know what you're exactly talking about. So sometimes when I'm talking, I like to throw some scientific names in there as well. But names can also be confusing on the common name level. And here's my example of that. So I grew up in Northeast Wyoming. I was definitely in firefly territory as far as nomenclature goes. I'm curious about that little swath, if you can see that sort of faint orangeness up through central and into northern Wisconsin. I just wonder if you're all lightning bug folks or if you're more firefly people. And as a Wyoming kid, it's especially interesting in that I have very distinct memories one time in childhood of seeing fireflies flashing at my grandparents' ranch. And then I learned that that's not very common. And some people think that there are no fireflies west of the Mississippi, which is not true. There actually are, but they're just pretty rare and pretty hard to come by. And so I nearly convinced myself that I made up my childhood memory of fireflies, and I've since confirmed that yes, I probably did see them one time in childhood, but the fireflies out west are definitely a lot harder to come by, and they're not nearly as iconic as they are here in the Midwest and in the East. And so my first real vivid memories of fireflies and lightning bugs was I was 30 marching around Western Pennsylvania, and just like, you know, any person with their first experience, you know, I became a 5-year-old boy where I grabbed the lightning bugs, I put them in the jar, I kept them overnight, popped little air holes, I smeared them on my cheeks like little, you know, football player paint under my eyes. You know, I had to sacrifice those for the experience, but definitely iconic nature experiences. But what really blows my mind is for fireflies, a lot of times that flashing is a breeding response, right? So they're trying to attract a mate to come in. But there are some really deceptive fireflies out there that do sort of a false flash to bring in what this firefly thinks is coming in to mate, but this is actually a different species that's mimicking a firefly to then predate them. And so sort of the bait and switch, which doesn't end well for this poor little firefly. What's also really cool is in the East, there's a couple of places. There's Smokies, and in Congaree National Park, and also in Allegheny State Park in New York, there's the synchronous fireflies. It's one of the only places that all the fireflies match up and flash at the same time. And so I mention this at every talk I ever give because this too was one of my bucket list experiences, but I've not been able to experience this. And so you have to have a lottery ticket to get in access to the Smokies fireflies. And so I have a calendar set, I have a little alert set to remind myself to apply every year. I want you all to apply next year for the Synchronous Firefly Lottery. So when you win, you invite your friend Ken to be your +1, so I too can experience the Synchronous Fireflies of the East. Freshwater mussels. Here's another name game we got. So if we can get this poll, freshwater mussels are an overlooked part of nature. So what is the best freshwater? Are any of these freshwater mussels? I watched Barbara Kingsolver give a presentation earlier this spring on Zoom, and she's got a wonderful poem that'll be out in her book this fall about the names of freshwater mussels. And so I was pretty happy that she also gives them a shout out. But anybody want to vote for any freshwater mussels? Do you think these are all? Do you think I made these names up? The hickory nut, the pig toe, the mucket, the heel splitter, the pimpleback, and the giant floater. We got some poll results. What do people think about freshwater mussel names? I should have put a vote on there, like Ken made them all up. I bet that would have gotten the most votes. I don't know. I'm not finding any results. Did we get some results?
We're waiting on a few more people if they want to vote.
Okay.
Seconds.
You can't vote twice, Patrick Hogan.
All right, we're going to end the poll.
Nobody voted for the hickory nut? Come on. And the giant floater also did not get any votes. Those are all actual mussel names. The hickory nut, the pig toe, the mucket, the heel splitter, the pimpleback, and the giant floater. So yeah, those are all correct answers. Mussels are super fascinating though. We actually have some of the world's best diversity. I think sometimes when we think of wildlife and just biodiversity in general, we think, oh, you have to go to the tropics to see all of these numbers of plants and animals and wildlife. And for salamanders and for freshwater mussels, sort of Central and Appalachian North America, some of the greatest concentrations of diversity. With the mussels, they have a really cool life cycle, and so the young mussels rely on, in this case, I think it's the hickory nut mussel that relies on the sturgeon. They get lodged in either the gills or sort of attached to the body, and then these big prehistoric fish along their sort of riparian migration corridors moving up and down the waterways. These tiny little mussels then tag along, fall off. So that's how they rely on their distribution. And so it's so crazy to me that sort of the intricacies of nature playing out on that scale, and so kind of the interconnectedness. We're going to shift to the coastal marine environments now. And so this is a kind of a sea otter, another Jeremy Collins illustration. And for me, I spent a little bit of time in Southeast Alaska working on a flying squirrel project, but sort of that was my real experience on coastal living and watching the sea otters. And so sort of sea otters are considered one of the keystone species. And if you think of a keystone arch and sort of that top level and that keystone being the most important, the whole arch comes crashing down without it. And in ecology, this keystone species concept really just sort of means that that one individual species has such an impact on the greater ecosystem. And so for sea otters, they're feeding on the sea urchins and then keeping the sort of kelp levels intact. I think, so this is a river otter here. It says, I think you've confused me with someone who builds a dam. Beaver is the other sort of iconic example of a keystone species. And it's actually one that I find a lot easier to visualize. You know, if you think of a mountain stream or any stream there, and these beavers come and actually sort of dam it up and shift that from a moving riparian zone to more of a stagnant pond. So that keystone species really applies. But what's cool about that intertidal zone on the coast, if you've got these river or these sea otters sort of foraging about and that kelp zone down at low tide, that's what's driving that ecosystem. But if you look at this, the different bands along the intertidal zone, so if you're a low tide critter or plant or animal, you're adapted to spend much of your life wet, right? Those kind of tides are going to keep you underwater, except for the extreme lowest of tides. Meanwhile, if you're up on the top of that zone, if you're a little barnacle up there, you're dry and exposed for much of the day until that highest of tide comes in and inundates you with wetness and water. And so you're adapted to a much drier climate. You might only be, 10, 15 feet, yards away, but extremely different lifestyles. But this illustration also reminded me of the bands on a mountain range. So a much grander scale. So where I grew up, kind of the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming, you've got these prairie plants at the bottom of the mountain. As you go up, you get some of that ponderosa pine band along lower elevations, and then you get higher up to the lodge poles, and then you get above that some of the subalpine firs, and then up to those kind of rocky talus slopes where the pika lives. These bands in nature. And I think for me as a naturalist, I always need to remind myself that things actually are in a fairly uniform and orderly fashion in nature. The trick is just being able to unwind that mystery and and for this, it's often precipitation, it's sort of temperature and moisture levels. So sort of that banding really reminded me of the intertidal zone, which I thought was kind of a fun concept. But then to take it on the next broad scale, this is sort of a representation of the 100th meridian. And so John Wesley Powell, he's the guy that floated the Grand Canyon the first time. He's also an early geologist, but he noticed that sort of the Midwest get a lot more moisture, a lot bigger prairie species, kind of that tall grass prairie. And then as the farther west you travel, get into that sort of short grass prairie ecosystems, and what's really fascinating to me is that this has been a well-known, well-documented zone sort of linkage across the continent. But as the climate's shifting and the climate's getting drier, that 100th meridian has slowly shifted. It's about 140 miles farther east now. And so really this concept is more applicable to the 98th meridian. And sort of these big zones are not entirely stagnant. Sort of nature is always a shifting constant. And so last keystone species concept, this is actually taken from some of my kids' books that I worked on, these illustrations, but that prairie dog is another one of those iconic keystone species where one individual is impacting the entire ecosystem, and by burrowing and and you got to kind of grazing that landscape. They're altering it. And so large ungulates prefer to graze on these shorter, fresher growths. The endangered black-footed ferret up there in the top right corner there, it's kind of a personal favorite story of mine, being a Wyoming native, that the ferret was thought to have been extinct. And then Shep the cow dog brought his dead carcass back to his little cow dog owner, and the owner didn't know what it was, and took it to the local vet, and they're like, "Oh yeah, that's definitely the endangered black-footed ferret that we thought was extinct." And so, I had some friends that worked on some of those early restoration projects where they ended up trapping all of the knowns, kind of the one now population, all of the ferrets. They brought them into captivity, and they were down to I think 18 individuals, and started doing some captive breeding. And so now I got to work on ferrets in New Mexico for a bit, and sort of with that breeding now able to release them onto the landscape in different places. But my other favorite thing about prairie dog towns, I will never look at them the same now. I was talking to Emily before this presentation, and I told her that a lot of times I felt like my knowledge was like a playa. It was very broad but pretty shallow. And Emily says that she thinks the way to approach it is much more like a prairie dog town, where it could be broad and shallow with deep tunnels of information, and they're all interconnected underneath the surface. And so I like that analogy much better. So I'm going to say my knowledge is much more like a prairie dog town now. So thanks for that, Emily. Kind of marching on through our seasons. We're getting into late summer now, and National Moth Week was just, I think, last week. It's the last full week of July. This is such a great citizen science, community science opportunity. I think moths are the next big thing in nature. It's slowly starting to build momentum. I don't know if you've done moth programs there or not, but I hope you have. And if not, I challenge you to do them again. It's one of the coolest things, whether you set up a black light, whether you just leave your porch light on, or whether you make, kind of a moth bait, which is basically the cheapest beer you can get, a fermented banana, some molasses. However, each people have their own sort of special concoction of baits, but mothing is the coolest thing out there right now. It's sort of my new favorite thing in nature. We shift to the fall season. I'm reminded of, growing up out west and those mountain high elevations, the fall sets in early at 10,000 feet, and the aspens start to change, kind of in northern Wisconsin, kind of those birch woods starting to change, and kind of New England, all of those deciduous forests, those early fall colors shifting. This is an aspen tree from the Pando Grove, which is in Utah, and it's just this huge, I can't remember this, how many acres this covers, but what blows my mind is it is one individual tree stand with a bunch of trunks, and all of that is covered with a single clone. It's one of the oldest species, one of the largest species on the planet. These aspen, trees, what we think of as individual trees, can actually be connected like that. And there's growing research that not with the aspens, but with other trees, where different trees are actually shifting nutrients and almost communicating in underground networks through the fungal mycorrhizal zone and stuff. It's just, there's so much to learn about nature, and I think we've been pretty into nature for a long time, and we just have more questions than answers at this point. It's such a fascinating realm to be involved with. Fall, we're starting to talk about migrations again. I think migrations oversold the simplicity of migration. You're just like, oh, birds fly south for the winter. It's not the case for all birds. That's, some birds fly to the coast for winter, and some birds don't migrate at all. And for some birds, south is northern Wisconsin, if you think of like redpolls or crossbills or things, so. But this is one of the champion migrators, and for you hardcore bird people, you'll recognize that this is actually a spring plumage black-poll warbler, even though I'm talking about it in the fall, so apologies for that. But this little warbler, kind of a ball pinpoint size critter, moves across the boreal forest to the mid-Atlantic, and then it tanks up, it just puts on some body reserves, puts on some body fat, flies from, say, Delaware, 3 days nonstop to Northeast South America on its annual migration, where it, sort of uses up that gas tank of reserves. It's just such a phenomenal, mind-blowing experience that nature has. I think people are starting to recognize that the monarch butterfly is also a big champion in fall migration. This is a tagged butterfly here in central Iowa. The researchers, kind of the citizen science community volunteers have tagged butterflies for a number of years. And last year we had 4 butterflies tagged here in central Iowa that were respotted down in the Mexican wintering range. The green darner, I loved got it right here. Emily's book, The Green Darner Press. So I'm sure you're familiar with the green darner being another champion migrator, and sort of each generation, whether they're migrating south and a new generation migrating north, sort of that interconnectedness. And again, that research was sort of revealed based on citizen science. And so I, challenge you all to be more involved. And I know you do great programs there at the museum. Fall to me is also a time of getting ready for the winter. And so this is the acorn woodpecker. They collect acorns all year, but the acorn woodpeckers, the red squirrels, the tanking up, getting their reserves stockpiled ready. I can definitely relate to that. And I think of hiking through the mountains out west, and even in the summertime, you can see where these winter sort of stockpiles of seeds and pine cones have accumulated. It's called a squirrel midden. And those places where the squirrels just sit there and eat and survive all winter long. Winter, we're going to go back to the southeast. We're going to go back to Florida for kind of here in the closing. And we got the ghost orchids, where again, when we think we have nature figured out, and there for a long time, researchers thought that this, endangered plant species, the ghost orchid, was pollinated by one sphinx moth, kind of the giant sphinx moth. But even in the last couple of years, it's been revealed with some camera traps and stuff that there are a couple of different species that are involved in that. So we're still learning so much about nature. And I just hope that we can appreciate that nature is out there, because, we'll never see a passenger pigeon again. We'll never see a Carolina parakeet. I'm just devastated that I won't get the chance to see a native Carolina parakeet because, we thought of it as a commodity that was endless, and that's not the case. Luckily, though, we're making some progress, and I like to end on some positive notes where, we think of things like the bald eagle, where it wasn't that long ago that eagles were on the very concerned, could have gone either way. And so with some early Earth Day support and some changes in environmental laws, kind of the DDT stuff, especially with the eagles, we were able to witness some recoveries. And so there is some glimmers of hope out there. So Margaret Murie got it right. Wilderness itself is the basis for all of our civilization. Joseph Cornell got it right. Share nature with children. Edward Abbey got it right. Get out there and hunt and fish and mess around. Dr. Seuss got it right. Speak for the trees have no tongues. Jane Goodall got it right. What you do makes a difference. Senator Gaylord Nelson got it right. Celebrate Earth Day every day. And you are all getting it right too by being naturalists. Celebrate nature, have enthusiasm for nature in your own backyards. I challenge you to be generalists, not specialists. We learned from black-hooded ferrets and others that specialists are what's going to go extinct and generalists are what survives. So celebrate all things nature, celebrate the birds, the mammals, the botany, the mushrooms, the invertebrates, all parts of the ecosystem. Get out there and remember that, nature is not a museum. It needs to be hands-on. Tag those grandkids along, bring your kids, bring your neighbors out there and let them touch and experience nature. Kind of nature immersion therapy is my solution and my prescription for nature deficit disorder. I think many of you are involved with the Master Naturalist programs. Be involved, provide ongoing learning and mentorship opportunities, and most importantly, be proud of nature and wear your binoculars everywhere so you can be a nature champion. Thank you so much for having me, and yeah, if we have any questions, you can track me down on any of the socials, and yeah.